Hi, Celeste.
Hi, Joanna. Thank you so much for being here with me. I really appreciate it.
I'm so happy to be here. I think maybe what we should say that, I think this is going to be a lie, but I was going to say we are the only two psychiatrists in the world who also have MFAs in poetry.
I think that that's probably reasonable.
I think there might be a few other, but it's like a rare event that we're seeing. Would you like to start reading something, or what, should I warm you up with a question?
Let's warm up a little.
Okay, all right. So I love Celeste books so much, and for those of you who haven't read it, it's remarkable. And the thing that stood out to me in reading it is that, you know, poem by poem, it's beautiful. Each poem is so elegantly constructed and thoughtful and gorgeous. But one of the things that interests me the most about it is that a lot of times you see poetry collections and it's just like the best group of poems that someone has written over X period of time, which is fine way. I've constructed a book of poems that way. But I think what really interests me is that there is a larger construction going on in the book that I would love to hear you talk a little bit about.
Sure. Thank you for that question, Joanna. Thank you all so much for coming. I really, really appreciate it. And for all of you who are watching online. So this book is a total nightmare to read from because all the poems are connected, as Joanna suggested. So it's really hard to kind of extract individual poems. And one of the reasons that's the case is there's a long poem kind of woven throughout the book. The reason that this delightfully creepy rabbit eye is on the front of the book, which I adore, is that a lot of the poems center around different magic tricks. And the first section focuses on the act of pulling a rabbit from a hat. And those magic poems that are woven throughout the book really tell the story of my experience as a patient. And then the second half is my experience becoming a physician, and kind of that journey through medicine. Should I read some of those?
I would love for you to.
Okay. And I will say that I worked with a lovely woman locally that did a beautiful letter press of this first poem I'm going to read. And if you buy your book here tonight, I'm giving some of them away. And if you buy online, I'm also going to give some away. So these are some of the rabbit poems from the book. So they're in the first section of the book. I'm going to read them, a few of them in order, but they are sprinkled throughout the first section. And again, this is sort of my journey as a patient, moving into my journey as a medical trainee. Rabbit. Some hats are more likely to contain rabbits. I flipped bowlers, put my ear to a turban's origami, fingered the linings of Sunday bonnets, and came up empty. I regret to inform you, said the silence, that not all things are possible. A cage for every bunny, a hook for every hat, a pillow for every head that dreams of finding something hidden. So often we miss it. Once I saw a man holding a Russian doll, unaware of all the women in his palm. Even God, bringing light into the world, was pleasantly surprised to find inside the white a split of yellow, red, blue, green. When the doctor says, we found something, I don't say, no shit, or, oh, thank God, I've been looking for that sweater everywhere, or, I have been discovering things for months. An ember in my stomach, rubies of blood clots studding the toilet bowl, the meaning of the word collapse. Instead, I nod and the silence unfolds itself like a paper crane until the doctor clears his throat and says, I'm sorry. She is a momentary miracle, the magician's white gloved fist around her neck, the 100 open mouths of velvet-seated gentlemen. How far away from carrot spears, tangled hay, honeysuckle petals? The men's wide eyes are twinned to the translucent skin inside her ears, her whiskers, the way her body lolls into the spotlight's glow. The magician hoists her, white and trembling, higher and higher. Look, his eyes seem to say, look at what I've made from nothing. In the schema I have established, the doctor is the magician and I am the rabbit. But I regret to inform you that there are other possibilities. God is also the magician, pulling the disease from the hat of my body. I am the magician even, some nights alone, finding inside the darkness a small, trembling thing I won't acknowledge as my own. This is someone else's rabbit, I say, and the silence nods back. I can pause there.
That's a beautiful place to
Oh,
pause.
thanks.
I think you you're getting at something. One of the things I admired about this is that with the rabbit, it seems like you're creating a metaphor that's kind of a through line, but also resisting the metaphor and sort of playing with the ways that the metaphor itself is limited. At least that was my sense of it. Yeah. I wonder if that's a good segue, because I think another thing that I think I see you do, and you can talk about this and maybe read a little bit about it. I also see you, I think, working with a similar tension between form and function, where you really seem to kind of know how to exploit the form and shape of a poem, but also play with and sort of work with the limitations of that form. And so I wondered if you might talk about that a little bit, maybe particularly with some of the poems that are in a received form or more generally, and then maybe I can ask you to read something.
Oh yeah, that'd be great. So Joanna and I met actually at Hopkins, where she was getting her MFA in poetry and I was a mere undergrad student, and she deigned to speak to me, which was very kind of her. One thing that was interesting about working as a student at Hopkins is that they're very old school, very interested in like what we call received forms. So that means like sonnets, villanelles, pantoums. So all these kind of older fashioned strict forms, which I love, as evidenced by there being 3 villanelles in this book. My husband cut me off because I was going to put 4 in. And I do appreciate that he stopped me because I think he was correct. But I'll probably read one of the villanelles.
They're really good. Can we just say, for those of you who have never attempted a villanelle, it's a beast. I mean, it's a nightmare. It's a nightmare to do it and not have it go very badly. So that's just my interjection.
Yeah, some of these forms are more strict or prescriptive than others. And the villanelle is basically a song of a poem that has 2 repeating verses or lines. And you have to repeat those same 2 lines, like, 4 times each or something insane. You'll hear when I read it. But I love the challenge of the form because you have to make the line new every time it's repeated, or that's what I like to strive for. And sometimes making the line new means you insert punctuation differently. So the words are kind of chopped up in a different manner. Some people will change the line itself a little bit, but I think the poem I'm going to read, I think actually the full lines stay the same and just the punctuation is what varies. The poem that I think I'll read of the villanelles is one that I like as an example of what you're talking about, because the content of the poem is kind of reflected in the form itself. So this poem is called Hospital Through a Kaleidoscope, and a kaleidoscope, which is very cool, I learned about this while I was working on the poem, is like if a telescope and a kaleidoscope had a baby, it would be a kaleidoscope. It's basically a telescope, but at the end you have different refractions. And so instead of a kaleidoscope where you're refracting different like gems and jewels at the end, you're refracting what you're actually looking at. So I would kind of be refracting the audience if I was looking out to you. And what I really liked about that is that that's kind of what the poem is doing with the lines. It's sort of refracting the same image over and over. And so that was why I chose this form in particular. So listen for the repeating lines. You won't not be able to hear them because they're going to come up like 6 times. Let me find this one. And this is, I think, the 3rd of the 3 villanelles, if you can believe it. So this is called Hospital Through a Kaleidoscope, and it has a quote from Job at the beginning, and the quote is, "They die in an instant, in the middle of the night. The people are shaken, and they pass away. In bed, I shake the world by turning glass. Twisting the plastic tube, I shut one eye, watch the people break apart and pass out of my lens. This is my morning mass, mosaic of pills, white nurses floating by. In bed, I shake the world. By turning glass, I split the mother's dying son, the brass-necked stethoscope, the doctor's tucked-in tie. I watch the people break apart and pass my curtained room. I fill 6 test tubes, wine glass thin with blood. I fast, I sleep, I lie in bed, I shake. The world, by turning glass to dust, scatters what we thought would last. The mother down the hall keeps screaming, why? I watch the people break apart and pass away. That night, the doctor cups my mass benign like bread between his hands. I cry in bed. I shake the world. By turning glass, I watch the people break apart and pass.
It's so good. I'm just whispering without my mic on. It's so good. It's so good. It's so well. The thing I will add to Celeste's comment about how we met. The funny thing is, yes, I was a graduate student. I was getting my MFA at Hopkins, and Celeste was an undergraduate. But she was, I never know how to pronounce this word. She was a wunderkind. She was something of like this phenomenon. So long before I met her, other grad students in the MFA program, Jake and other people, they were saying to me, "Oh, have you met this young student, Celeste? She's like Joanna 2.0. She's gonna go to medical school and she's incredible and I mean, it was basically like you were the young genius of Hopkins. And then of course I met Celeste and she was an absolute delight. And then we're the only 2 MFAs in poetry and psychiatrist in all of America.
That's what we're gonna go with.
That's what we're gonna stick with. Yeah, I love that as an example. And I do think that you work with form so elegantly. And I think that for those of you who haven't read the book, I think the trick of a received form is that you are making it new and you don't feel, it feels like the way you see an ice skater and it looks effortless. I think it feels effortless and it feels like it is sort of, you couldn't have conveyed this content any other way and it just happens to be in a received form. And I think often it does enrich the meaning. I was wondering if, I think you do it so well, if you might read a sonnet also, if you feel like it.
Yeah. Well, it's funny because my husband is working on a review of a book of sonnets, and he was telling me yesterday about this definition of a sonnet that he read, which I believe, I might misquote this, is a poem is a sonnet if it behaves like a sonnet, which I couldn't disagree with, but also didn't seem like a fully complete definition. So I'm going to read more of a sonnet, which just means that it rhymes. I wrote this poem because I was in a slump during my MFA, and I thought, wouldn't it be interesting to start imitating other people in my group to see if they would notice? It was a way to kind of like push myself out of my comfort zone, because I went to an MFA program that was, everyone's style was extremely varied in my year, which I loved. But it was also, a big challenge to try to help each other with our poems when we were trying to do such different things. But this poem in particular, one of my friends was writing these beautiful poems without any punctuation, with lots of space in them. And so to compensate for that, my crutch, I was like, I'll make it a sonnet, even though I'm not going to use punctuation and not going to use capitalization. And this poem kind of came about because I listened to a Radiolab episode. I went to, in my MFA, getting a fiction MFA was Lulu Miller, who was one of the people who started Radiolab. And so I got really hooked on Radiolab while I was there. And in this particular episode called Falling, she's interviewing a friend of hers, and the friend of hers is speaking about a recent relationship breakup with a man who had prosopagnosia, which is face blindness. And she's describing to Lulu the experience of seeing this person after the breakup and him not recognizing her, not because, he's trying to intentionally keep his face, but he just doesn't see her face and recognize it in that way. So I thought, Wow, that's definitely a poem. So this is called Sonnet, and the subtitle is For My Ex-Lover with Prosopagnosia. You carry a slice of silver, push breadcrumbs off tablecloths, the color of hour-old snow, scattered like rafts across the heated patio. Lean toward an old man, a regular, who mumbles, calamari or gnocchi, it's hard to tell. Twice a night, I walk by on my way to the pharmacy to buy floss, aspirin, anything small and practical I can palm in my pocket as you continue not finding me. Your memory tethered to identifying tricks, my red bag, my laugh, a porch full of wind chimes, the way I walk like I'm falling. My face is a stitch disappearing into a quilt, a word that rhymes with all other words. Unheard, unseen, every night you scrape the tables clean.
That's how you write a sonnet, friends. That's how it's done. Yeah. Oh my gosh. Yeah, I love that. I love so many of these. I wondered, I want to ask you other things, but I think maybe I might ask you if you would read Infusion Room Praise Song, and then maybe that can be our segue into the question I want to ask.
Sure. So this poem is actually, it's so funny that you have me read this next, because this was the other poem where I was imitating someone else in my class. These are the only two poems that made it into the book from that short-lived exercise. I don't remember if anyone ever noticed that I was doing this, but this one, I was imitating my dear friend Chelsea, who writes these really vast, emotionally explosive poems, also with no punctuation. But this is not a sonnet. This is just a regular poem. And this poem talks about my experience getting infusions for Crohn's disease, which I talk about a lot in the book. And that is a very common experience that I have, because I've been doing this since I was, I think, a sophomore in college. But when I first started getting the infusions, it was a pretty scary experience. You're sort of warned, like, you might have an allergic reaction at any time. And so often my friends would come with me to the infusion and kind of sit with me and chat during it. Or if they couldn't come, they would call me during the infusion and we would chat. And so this poem is kind of about one of my friends who would be very present for me during this time, which I really appreciated. And it's called Infusion Room Praise Song. When the IV bag shrinks moon-like over my head and purple blossoms in my elbow crook, people stare at me the way I look at a three-legged dog in the bad part of town. When my dog dies, I will not have a heart big enough to bury her. I commission you to do it. Scrape of the shovel hitting clay, dirt arcing into the air, the way they say the soul does after death. During infusions, I use my shoulder to hold the phone to my ear. When you call, the nurse is tying the tourniquet. The nurse is tying the tourniquet, I say. And because you know I hate this part, for the same reason I hate long, enclosed slides at water parks, all that tight darkness, you say, let me tell you a story. Your grandfather went to war with a bad heart. His doctor said, you won't come back anyway. He pinched Kentucky soil into a matchbox, kept it in his shirt pocket as he cut through clouds, watched bombs fall behind him like fish through the waterfall of the air. When he was shot down by Germans, the soldiers stripped him, shook out his shirt, and found the matchbox. What is this? They asked. What is this? In German. Sounds like branches snapping under boots. What is this? What is this? What is this? A whole tree ground to mulch. They beat him against the wall. In war, it is easy to mistake a matchbox full of dirt for a matchbox full of explosive powder. When I was very sick, hope was a dog lost in the night. I stood in the doorway. I let the doorway prop me up. I could not call the dog back. This is what happens when we don't teach each other our names. Celeste Lipkes on a band around my wrist. Remember this. While I am well, I am hoarding everything for later. Pool of pink petals we fall in together. Dumplings dripping soy sauce into my lap. Reflection of my newly baptized face in the lake. This is the dirt my pockets are full of. Who can blame us for wanting to die on our own land?
I like that one. This is not my real question, but I'm just curious. This is my preliminary big question. I'm curious because it's always so interesting how writers construct things. I think especially initially, later, I think in the act of revision, we come back with maybe a more analytical mind. But when you started writing Infusion Room Praise Song, if you remember, did you know that you were going to make that associative leap to like wartime and the matchbox with the dirt in it and soil, or did that come to you, guided by instinct as you were writing the poem?
I think it came because I was thinking of this particular friend and some of the conversations that come up. It's interesting when you're literally tied to an IV pole, the kinds of things people will tell you, because you're sort of stuck there, right? I mean, I wasn't stuck with my friend. I was so happy she was there, but you're a captive audience in a lot of ways. And so I remember her telling me a story and being so shocked by it because it was, she's just a very lighthearted person. And when she told me the story, I was like, again, the moment of like, that's a poem. But I think it just came up when I was thinking about being with her in that moment. And the way my friend who I was imitating writes poems, again, they're very like explosive into other narratives. Yeah. And so I just sort of let that happen. Whereas if I was writing this poem my way, I might not have included that.
It works. I like it. I like it. That was my preliminary question. Here's my other maybe broader question. I think I would love to hear you talk about the richness, but maybe also the challenges of writing autobiographically, especially when it comes to your own experience as a patient in the healthcare system and dealing with a chronic illness. And I would just love to hear about that if you care to share.
Oh yeah. So I think for a lot of folks who have medical conditions, particularly if you're going to be entering like a medical field, there's always this tension about disclosure, right? Like, should I tell my employer that I have this issue? Should I tell medical schools? Are they going to not accept me if I, share this information? And I'm actually doing a presentation next week where I'm talking about my experience as a medical student with a chronic illness, using these poems and kind of using it to advocate for recruiting those kinds of students and how to retain them essentially and support them. For me, I think when I sort of finally embraced my diagnosis, I was very vocal about it pretty indiscriminately, such that if you like Googled my name, it would be like, Celeste Lipkes has Crohn's disease and here's an article about her. So I think at that point I was like, well, it's already on the internet. And so I didn't really struggle with the self-disclosure bit in the book so much. I do think it's hard to write about an illness where you're talking about diarrhea. Yeah. So there's definitely like some interesting challenges of body taboos. And I think that's one of the reasons why I clung to this like magic metaphor, because as is revealed in the book, I was watching a lot of like magic shows and tricks while I was very sick. But I think it gave me a way to kind of subvert some of that taboo and to just kind of lean on those magic tricks a little bit. And you'll see throughout that long poem, there are moments where that kind of breaks down, like in the Dove. I can read that next. Yeah, that would be helpful. Where I finally there's a lot of sort of dancing around of like symptoms that I'm having and experiences that I'm having. And then finally in this section that I'll read a part of, I'm like, this is actually what's going on. And to have those moments of, vulnerability, but then to kind of come back and forth between that. That's sort of the mode that I prefer in writing and in reading. Should I read some of the
I think you should. Okay. Yeah, I think that's,
So we did some rabbit. Now we're gonna do some dove. The dove series is a little bit, it's similar to the rabbit and it's focused on this magic trick, this one being making a dove disappear. It's sort of a different stage of my illness journey in which I finally get a diagnosis, which is a very big deal if you have an illness and you're sort of wondering, like, who's going to be treating me? What is that going to look like? So I'm going to read a couple of the dove poems. Dove. There is a bird that will sing both halves of a duet when its mate dies, but that bird is not a dove. There is a bird from the swamp of my childhood, all dinosaur and plume, but that bird is not a dove. There is a bird that crosses oceans with clouds of its compatriots, but that bird is not a dove. Negate all of birddom in search of the most silent, the most docile, the most willing to forget its form in favor of a handkerchief, a lit match. Animalia cordata vertebrata aves columbiformis columbidae. Say this prayer until the white one appears. Columbidae columbiformis aves vertebrata cordata animalia disappears. I have a chronic autoimmune illness named after the man who discovered it. Imagine if God named everything God. Burl Bernard Crohn. Crohn's disease is characterized by inflammation of the gastrointestinal tract. I am in the hospital because doctors say I am failing to thrive. I weigh 98 pounds and use the bathroom 17 times a day. My father does not say much, but looks at me with wide eyes when he thinks I am asleep. My mother takes notes in a yellow legal pad and twists her wedding ring around and around. No one asks what makes me happy now, that I can't dance or go to high school or eat fettuccine Alfredo. I watch Whose Line Is It Anyway? And take the hottest shower I can stand with my face pressed against the frosted window. I don't remember asking my mother if I'd ever feel better, but she says I did, says she went home and pulled the car into the garage, turned off the car, closed the garage door, and cried. When I go to sleep, I feel myself slipping like sand between the twin fists of an hourglass. Only the yellow legal pad knows how many times my medications have been switched. Promethazine, budesonide, mesalamine, azathioprine, prednisone, sulfasalazine, hyoscyamine, dicyclamine, ondansetron, the names of Martian children. When the doctors believe I am wasting away by small enough increments, I am released from the cage of the hospital. The days shuffle into place like cards in a deck. I go to class when I can, take my pills in the bathroom, try to ignore the girls whispering to each other about how I have an eating disorder. A mother of a girl in my dance class approaches my ballet teacher, says she is concerned for my well-being. She spends our class in the lobby, gossiping about the latest diet trends. Fat bitch, my mom says, and we smile and go shopping for jeans that will fit. Did you know that they make size 00? 2 zeros for the extra empty. When a boy in my chemistry class asks if I'm dying, I say yes, and everyone leaves me alone. When teachers pull me aside and ask if I need extensions on my assignments, I say no. When I ask God if I will ever feel normal again, I take the silence to mean maybe. I can keep going.
You read one more. Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah.
My fever is so high, I hallucinate mice circling the IV pole, my dead grandmother dragging a fork through my Jell-O cup. What do people do, I ask the nurse, when they can't stop seeing things? She hands me a stack of paper and teaches me to fold a crane. The type of trickery that women love, when a caged bird vanishes beneath a cloth and 1, 2, 3 reappears unharmed, a dove cupped in the magician's palm, the way I saw a mother hold her baby's flopped back head. My son, my only son. The secret is there are 2 birds. The cage, collapsible, yields to the magician's fist. Pop of bone, wreck of wings and mangled beak. The magician pulls another not dead dove from deep within his sleeve. The kind of trickery I need to see. Kill a bird and don't pretend to bring it back.
You're so good. I love it. Well, it is kind of, I mean, not to extend your metaphor, but it is a kind of sleight of hand, because I think you are writing about something that is bodily and there are taboos, and, you know, for lack of a better word, it's sometimes gross. I mean, as human bodies with illnesses can be. And I think you walk this lovely tense line of sort of operating in a kind of space of really effective metaphor with magic, et cetera, and then also being very plain spoken about it in time. So this is why your reputation at Hopkins preceded you. I would love to hear, oh gosh, before we have time for other questions, I think the flip side of this, and I think part of what makes this book so interesting, is the fact that you are not only a person who has great insight into the patient perspective, as we all have had or will have if we hadn't already, but also the medical training side. And so I wondered if you wanted to talk about that side, and then maybe we can pick a representative poem. Perhaps.
Sure. Yeah, so I was actually just reminded of this because I was trying to find a professor's email and realized I had written like most of the rabbit and dove section in one particular class during my MFA. And I was like, oh my gosh, I don't remember doing that at all. The second half of the book, the magic sections kind of switched to focusing on my journey through medical school. And so the tricks in those two sections are cutting a woman in half, which to me is a crazy magic trick. Yeah. And also very representative of how I felt in med school of like, am I a patient or a physician? Am I a physician or a writer? Like, what am I doing here? And can I like be a whole person with all these things? And then the last section is called Escape, and it's focused on different escape acts. And I think to your point about the sort of like sleight of hand, I think when you're writing a long poem, which is a ridiculous undertaking because poems are not supposed to be long, and to extend a poem to that length and ask your reader to follow along with you, I think is a big ask. I think a lot of successful long poems are very self-referential and sort of like, I don't know what I'm doing. And that's kind of how there's a section at the end of the book in the escape section where I think I literally say something like, you are also a magician, reader. If you find a way out of this poem, please let me know. Like, please help me get out of this long poem. I don't know how to get out of it. And so that was a really helpful kind of mode to be in when writing this ridiculously lengthy piece.
I love that. I love it. And actually I was going to suggest some of the hemicorporectomy poems, but if you have other ones that are kind of from that side, I'd love to hear you read them.
Yes. So these are the hemicorporectomy, which is a fancy medical word for cutting someone in half. I'll just read a couple of these, and that might take us to time, we'll see. Hemicorporectomy. Noun. 1. A radical surgery in which the body below the waist is amputated, transecting the lumbar spine. 2. King Solomon's prescription for justice. During medical school orientation, I began a trick that takes years to perfect, transfiguring the cape of my hospital gown into a white coat, charming the snowflake smock to dissolve. I keep ending up with only half of me doctor. I'm a turncoat with a stethoscope, reciting the Hippocratic Oath. A standardized patient tells us about her pain, and we practice empathic responses. Women like it when you listen, says a surgeon. Nod your head, he says. Say things like, I can only imagine. Scenario 1. The day we bisect the cadaver's face, I am cutting 2 women in 2. The boys flip her onto her back, cursing her weight, 4 inches of slick yellow fat over her torso. We elevate her head with a wooden block, pull a sheet up to her neck, the claws of her hands dangling over the edge of the table. Check for dentures, says the professor. They're impossible to cut through. I run my gloved finger over her gums, the dryness startling me back into my body. Everything that should be wet isn't. Her amber skin, her half-closed eyes, between which one of the boys draws a line with his finger from scalp to clavicle. Here, he says, and lets the saw shriek through her forehead. Scenario 2. The day we bisect the cadaver's face, I stay in bed. True story. Before illusion device patent number 1458575, before Chris Angel pulled apart a woman on a park bench, Horace Galden premiered his trick at the Hotel McAlpin. The box was 3 people deep, too large for deception, said critics. But his mistake was selecting a bellboy with a jaunty red drum of a hat to saw into halves. Truncating a man, they said. Who wants to see that?
Should I ask one more question
Yeah.
and then we let other people?
Yeah, that sounds great.
I always, you can decline this, but I always like to know, not that you have any time, I know that because you're being a psychiatrist and healing minds, but what are you working on next? What are you working on, or what would you like to be working on as far as like future writing projects?
I love the second part of that question. One of the things about being in medicine, which Joanna's career doesn't seem to speak to because she's so prolific and so productive, despite having 2 beautiful children and working full time, is that being in medicine gives you a lot of content and no time or emotional space to process any of it. True, yes. So I think that, interestingly, similar to your trajectory as a lapsed poet, I've been working on a lot of essays, sort of drawn to like the longer forms of writing about different experiences as a patient and a physician. And I'm getting into that space where this book really ends in medical school. So I haven't written much about residency or my time in medicine after that. And so thinking about how to write about that responsibly now that I have interactions with patients that have been very affecting, but also need to be protected. So I've been working on some lyric essays and then hopefully eventually some more poems as well.
I'm so excited to read those essays and future poems. Maybe we should see if other people in the audience or the virtual audience have questions, you think?
Yeah. We're getting a thumbs up.
Yeah.
2 thumbs up.
2 thumbs up. Yes.
Yes.
Wow, thank you. It's really, amazing. I'm excited to see them on the page. I'm just curious, in writing so directly from your own life across like a really kind of big span of time, what surprised you, what you learned by processing your life through poetry?
That's a great question. So I'm going to repeat it because I've been told several times to repeat the questions. And I hope I repeat it well. So the question was, when you're writing autobiographical content across a many number of years, what kind of surprises you in terms of what you kind of are processing through that? That's a great question. I felt like compiling this book was incredibly therapeutic for me, particularly in seeing it alive and in the world. It was written during a time where there wasn't that space to process. And so in trying to remember moments that I wanted to write about, I was glad that I took a lot of notes. There were things that Professor said, like the surgeon that I quoted, where he's like, women like it when you, whatever. You should ask how they're doing and sit down when you talk to them. And I was like, yeah, that doesn't seem like it needs to be said, but okay. When I wrote down those things, it made it a lot easier, especially in medical school where you're like literally drinking from a fire hose, to try to recollect those moments. And I think in writing these poems, having the space to process, especially some of the illness stuff. You know, I was 14 when I first got sick, and like, I didn't really have any language for what I was going through, or, you know, the tools to kind of think about what was happening to me. I think what I realized in writing this book is like how traumatic that was. And that was really helpful for me to see that sort of laid out on the page, and then to say, yeah, that happened. And then I used it to do something else. So I really appreciated having that experience of writing the book.
We can do a question from the online audience.
Great.
If you like. Okay. So could you elaborate a little bit more on how being a poet has influenced the way that you see the world?
Should I repeat that? I'm getting the repeat sign. I'm going to do it. The question was how me being a poet has influenced the way I see the world. I think a couple moments earlier, I was like, that's a poem. I think when you're in the kind of like poetry writing mode, you start to pay a lot more attention, especially to visual things you're seeing out in the world, or snippets of language. Like I'll hear a patient say a phrase and I'm just like, oh my gosh, that's incredible. It's hard to stay in that space when you're in medicine and practicing consistently day after day. But when you're in that space, I do think you're very attuned to some of those moments. And I really appreciate having that sense of attention, because I think medicine has really destroyed my ability to pay attention in a lot of ways. In med school, you're asked to memorize, 80,000 things and to take in all this information, and you don't really get to sit and pay attention to one thing consistently. And so doing, working on a poem is one way of like having that meditative space outside of not being able to do that every day.
That's a good answer.
So how did the magic happen? By that I mean, where did you do magic from?
That's a great question. So the question was about the theme of magic. So not to spoil the end of the book, but there is a section at the end that talks about, and I like that this comes at the end, because I think the whole time you're like, why is she doing this? Like, why is she talking about magic so much? What is it? Where I talk about like being on prednisone, which gives you insomnia, or gave me insomnia, and sitting in the bathroom because I had to use the bathroom so many times, I just decided to live there essentially for a while, and watching videos of magic tricks on YouTube as like a distraction mechanism. So it was basically that plus the Who's line, which I referenced in an earlier section. And I think the thing about magic that I loved was, things disappear, but that they didn't actually disappear. There's like a controlled motion there where I felt very reassured. I know some people will watch magic tricks and really want to know how the trick was executed, and I didn't really feel that way at all. So it's interesting to do some research for this book, and I actually talk about the methods that some of these tricks use. So the cutting the woman in half, I described how there's one variation where the woman like sinks down into part of the box. There's another variation where the feet that come out the end of the box are a mannequin's feet. And so reading about that was kind of interesting, but it wasn't what drew me to the magic initially. It was more the sense of like awe and wonder. And I kept watching the David Copperfield making the Statue of Liberty disappear like over and over. So that's in the book as well. And I think part of me just wanted to disappear also. Like there was something really amazing about that. And so I just leaned into that very heavily. And so did the book cover designer, which is great. I love it.
Another question from the online audience is, did you write the long poems as sequences separate from the book, then decide that it made sense to split them apart and thread them through, or was that the plan all along?
That's a great question. So the question is related to the construction of the long poem and whether it was written separately from the book, and how I chose to incorporate it into the book itself, because like I mentioned, it is like woven throughout instead of just one chunk in the middle. I remember doing a workshop with, I think it was David Baker, and he was reading a bunch of my poems and he was like, you need to write a long poem. And I think it's because I write a lot in sections, and he was seeing that a lot of the sections were kind of echoing off of each other. And so I just took that as an invitation. I was like, well, if David Baker said let's write a long poem, should I write a long poem? And I took a long poem class at UVA during my MFA where we read a bunch of famous long poems. And then I got really into the form again. It's a ridiculous idea, but I started to write the long poem in that class. So I wrote the rabbit and the dove sections, but I hadn't gone to medical school yet, so I couldn't write the second half. And then I realized I wanted to continue the series. And so I wrote the second half during and after medical school. When I was putting the book together, I did initially have a long poem chunked in the center of the book. And I stole one of my husband's poetry teachers to look at my manuscript for me. And she was just like, no. And we were at a cafe, and she literally spread out every single sheet of paper on this giant table in the cafe. Thankfully, no one was there. I would have felt very self-conscious about all the space we were taking up, but she sort of shifted things around, and her version of the order was way more chaotic than this. She actually had like different magic tricks happening in different orders, excuse me. And that was just too much for me. That was just a bridge too far for me. But I loved the idea of separating out the tricks throughout each section. And so that's how the book ended up. And I feel really grateful for her for seeing that, like having that vision for me, because I don't think I would have been bold enough to do it on my own. I felt worried that people wouldn't get it, that they wouldn't realize that all the poems were connected. And I think people have read the book and not conceptualized those poems as a long singular poem, but I think that's fine as long as each section kind of contains in itself. I think that hopefully it achieves what it set out to do. You had a question?
So I was curious if you journaled when you were younger through this experience that you've had.
I used to be way better at journaling, yes. I also, so my mom writes fiction, my dad used to write fiction and then kind of went to the dark side and became a historian. But writing was always, and reading was just a big part of my life growing up. And so, you know, my mom and I would write like limericks for fun on the holidays, classic family activity. But I definitely took pretty good notes, I would say, particularly when I was quite ill. There wasn't much else to do but write. And so that, like I said, I think that those poems were a lot easier to come up with content because I had more tangible memories versus the medical school part where it was like, oh my gosh, what do I even choose to talk about? Like, there's just too much content. There are too many surgeons saying absurd things. Like I can't choose what I want to do. So yes, journaling I think was an important part. And even writing some of the poems like as things were happening. That was something that I remember doing as well. Yes.
Did you choose the cover for this book?
Great question. Did I choose the cover for this book? Ooh, how do I answer this? No, I didn't. But you know, I gave the I've never had a book before, so I had no idea how this would work. They asked me, you know, what kind of cover do you want? And I gave them a vision. And my idea was to have like an abdominal X-ray with swords going through it, because that's what the title of the book is, Radium Girl, which is a magic trick title. And that is basically a fancy version of cutting a woman in half, is the Radium Girl trick, where a woman's in a box and then there are like two, not even swords, like panels. It's very intense, shoved through. You can Google, like YouTube it, there's a clip. And then there's swords put in at various angles. I don't know how that one works, but I thought it would be a cool image to kind of suggest a lot of the themes of the book. And they came back with this cover, which I actually really love because one, it's so creepy. I think it really catches people's attention. One of my friends sent me a video of her small child reacting to this cover and like running towards it, screaming, running away, but then coming back. She's like, he can't stop looking at it, but he also can't stop screaming at it. Which I'm like, I think that means it's effective somehow. But I do think it captures, there's a lot in the book about like eyes, vision, looking. And so I think it kind of zeroes in on that. I have had people ask if this is the eye of my dog, which is not. My dog does not have red eyes, but hopefully it's clear to most folks that it's a rabbit, at least when they start reading it as well.
Another one for the online audience. Do you have any advice for making time for writing when you have a full-time profession?
Yeah, tell me that.
You really should be directing this question to Joanna, who, as I said, is incredibly productive. I'm very bad at this. I think there's this sort of idea that at least I need to get out of my head of like, I will start writing when X, Y, or Z occurs. Like, I will start writing once I have an attending job and I'm not in residency, or like, I will start writing again when I have my first book of poems out, which now, no excuse, Celeste, like it's done. You have to be writing again. I think honestly, reading a lot has been helpful for me. I know this is a crazy thing, but I didn't used to read a lot of novels, as you know.
Yeah.
And now I've really started to get into novels. I've started to read more poetry. And I think that act of reading makes me excited about writing again. And so I've been really trying to encourage myself to read more, partially by posting like very silly reviews on my Instagram of books that I'm reading. I'm very devoted to Goodreads, despite it being bought by Amazon. And that has been really fruitful for me.
Joanna, do you want to answer that?
Yeah, you should.
I don't have a good answer either, because I always crave, though I get the question, because I always want to hear people who say, well, I get up at 4:30 a.m. and then I make my special matcha and then I go to my nook with that really appeals to me. And I don't do that. I literally don't know how I've ever written anything, but it is somehow happened. And the only thing I know is when I'm in the thrall of something, I seem to suddenly ignore my children and have time. But like, I think I do have all the bad writing habits. I think I have the bad habits of a former poet, where it's fitful and I have the gift of efficiency, but not consistency. So I do agree that reading is good. Reading does give grist to the mill.
Exactly. Yeah, I think especially with poetry, there's definitely a temptation to just kind of wait for the inspiration. But sometimes that's what you have to do.
Yeah.
And so I like that because it gives me a little bit of an excuse as well.
Celeste, in closing, what's next for you?
Well, I'm very excited to be doing a few events for the book. And again, I'm super grateful for you all for coming, especially I feel so bad. My back's been turned to all my work colleagues this whole time. It might be their first poetry reading ever, but if it's their last, I'm definitely going to blame myself. I appreciate you all so much for coming. I'm going to keep practicing medicine and I'm going to hopefully keep writing the essays, working on some more poems. I know Joanna has some exciting writing news that I would love for her to share as well.
Sure, I have a novel coming out with Bloomsbury in 2024. So maybe if Malaprops would be so nice, I would love to come back.
We are
I really appreciate Malaprops for hosting. And again, if you buy books here, I do have beautiful bonus letterpress prints that I would love to share with you. Also very cool rabbit stickers that I will sign and put in your book. And if you buy from Malaprops online, if you're virtual, we're going to work out something hopefully where I can leave them some prints and they can mail them with the books, or I can get your address somehow and send them. So further goodies and incentives. Yeah.
Thank you so much for being here, Celeste.
Thank you. I really
Thank you all.
appreciate it.